The international drug control system is not perfect.
And who aim to replace them with policies that are more just and effective.
People are realizing that there are conventional medicines that don't work.
And unfortunately, the one who is being punished are the patients.
Prohibition has created illegality. Illegality creates crime and corruption.
The United Nations is not a straitjacket.
Not because drugs are good, but because prohibition is worse.
The plant is marvelous. There is so much to be gained.
Your source of cannabis news. Cannabis News Network.
The Israeli professor Raphael Meshulam was the key speaker at the third edition of the UFCM Eye Care Symposium in Strasbourg. Meshulam and his research group succeeded in isolating tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, the psychoactive ingredient in cannabis, for the very first time exactly 50 years ago.
50 years is a long time, very long time. I was a young man then. I'm not so young anymore.
After 50 years, the acceptance of medicinal cannabis the world over remains a slow process.
So until there is a complete separation between the illegal use and the medical use, people will always think, nothing, he's taking it for the high. Physicians like to use well-specified drugs.
Evidence-based.
Not only evidence-based, but also specified completely. They want to know what a person is getting. If you go to a physician, if you have anything, you go to a physician, the physician will say, take 300 milligrams of an antibiotic two times a day, take it for a week, then come back to me if it doesn't go away. They want to have something which is completely defined. With cannabis, it is not.
So, Meshulam pleads for more clinical trials because only then will cannabis be widely accepted as a cancer treatment in any form.
You see the possibility, but in order to do a large-scale study, you need funds. An academic person doesn't have the facilities to do something like that. A company has the facilities. It may cost a few $1 million. They can do it. I cannot. I mean, my funds are funny. I fight in order to get a grant of $50,000 in order to employ or to have a few students. That's it. So things are difficult in this respect for an academic person.
But the world seems to be awakening. More and more companies with increasing influence are becoming involved in research and development.
There is no patent, and if there is no patent, then why waste money? Waste, from their point of view. And I think that now there will be changes. There are going to be changes because maybe companies see that there is a big market for cannabidiol and maybe mixtures and so on. Maybe they will take and make derivatives like they have done with almost all drugs. They will take a drug and make a derivative which is more active and which is probably better. And so we can have something of that going on.
Professor Meshulam is not alone in his belief. Dr. Manuel Guzman, the Spanish researcher, has also called for more clinical trials.
We also need to prove clinically that cannabis is actually positive, is actually good for treating several diseases, because now sometimes the evidence is not so strong. So for the patients, it's nice to have a kind of shortcut and be able to use cannabisol and other preparations from the plant, but it would be nice to conduct robust clinical trials to get to know whether cannabis can be useful in different diseases.
Guzman has received funding for a new study on brain tumors.
We hope that with these trials, plus others that are being conducted in other places in the world, we'll be able to get to know finally whether cannabinoids are useful anti-cancer drugs and neuroprotective drugs in different diseases.
To make real progress in the development and study of cannabinoids, the plant itself should be legalized.
The main problem, I think, is that cannabinoid compounds are supposed to be active components of illegal drugs, so that they are into the what we call the Schedule I drugs. So it's very complicated and requires a lot of paper stuff to get the licenses for importing, for exporting, for managing all these compounds. So not only for basic research but also for clinical trials, it's pretty complicated to work with cannabinoids compared to other compounds that may be even more dangerous for the health, but they have not so many restrictions.
In some countries, such as Uruguay or the United States, in Washington and Colorado, the growing and use of cannabis is regulated. But if you visit Austria, you will come across huge plantations filled with cannabis seedlings without any problem.
Cannabis is legal as long as the plant does not flower. That's the reason why we can sell clones here. My employees have to be careful what they say to customers when they buy plants. For example, they are not allowed to explain anything to them.
It's big business.
I started 10 years ago with a small shop in Vienna. In the meantime, I have 30 employees. I pay millions of tax every year. It's growing. It's growing. The cannabis industry is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so we create a lot of new working places.
Using and selling the plant cannabis is as normal as buying a geranium. However, using the plant for any other purpose is illegal, even for medicinal use.
In Austria, you are not allowed to grow cannabis for medical purpose. The only thing which is allowed is dronabinol. That's synthetic cannabis you can buy in pharmacies, but you're not allowed to buy natural cannabis. The last 10 years when I started this business, people looked at me as a drug dealer. Nowadays they say, okay, it's a good business, you pay a lot of tax, have a lot of employees, and I hope this situation is getting better the next 10 years.
Connect with us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Foreigners are not allowed in coffee shops in the south of the Netherlands.
You born here in the Netherlands? You come from the Netherlands? No, so it's not allowed.
As a result of this policy, there is more crime and dealing on the streets. But the Dutch authorities refuse to see the negative effect and claim to be in control. Cannabis News Network wanted to experience this by driving round trip from France to Maastricht, the main city in the south of Holland. We'd just crossed the border when we were signalled by a Dutch car.
Moi ça va, ça va?
Oui, normal, sweet.
De la bœuf ou...
Non, la cam.
La cam?
Ouais.
Que la coco?
Oui, c'est bon, Christian. Sweet avec ton voiture, je parlais avec toi derrière.
Stay here, let's go somewhere else.
We drive on to the first petrol station along the highway in Holland. Again, we are approached.
Ouais, ça va. De la bœuf, vous avez de la bœuf? De l'herbe?
Ouais. Combien de ça?
Je sais pas, moi, pour 20 €, un truc comme ça.
Oh non, je vends en grande quantité.
Que des grandes quantités?
Grande quantité.
Ah, d'accord. Hoe is het tegenwoordig hier met runners en dat soort dingen?
Volgens racing eigenlijk.
Ouais. De la bœuf.
Si.
De l'herbe.
Oui.
T'as de l'herbe?
Si, mon ami. Toi, au coffee shop, alors je prends pour toi dans le coffee shop et là tu me donnes aussi quelque chose.
Okay, let's go, guys.
Ok, c'est bon.
Bon, allez, salut. Super, merci.
Bon marijuana, mon ami.
Bon marijuana.
Écoute, mon ami, tu appelles-moi mon ami, pas de problème.
D'accord.
Business, pas de problème. Tu peux fumer la coke, la héroïne, pas de problème, mon ami. Ecstasy, pas de problème.
D'accord.
Ça va,
tu as
mon
tout.
ami. Ça va?
Tu as tout.
Ok,
Bon.
tu appelles-moi, ça va, ok.
So, a random one-day experience led us to several dealers, runners, and we were able to buy everything. The dealers were persistent and sometimes aggressive in their behaviour. Not once were we stopped by the police, or was the police in sight. The next day, we leave the samples in Holland and drive back to France. Without being stopped by police and customs for smuggling drugs, we arrive safely back in Lille. To find out how difficult it is to buy some grass in Lille itself, we change the car and continue in a Dutch car. Only one inquiry is needed before we are given directions to a metro station 5 minutes away.
Hollande?
Ouais, mais je parle
Ah, tu parles français?
pas de problème. Non, je veux.
Ouais, combien tu veux?
10 €. Tu vas me chercher 10 €?
Là, tu veux combien? Ça fait bizarre, hein, quand même.
Mais ouais, mais bon, tu sais, les Hollandais, ils amènent pas très vite.
Hein?
Ils viennent pas chercher.
Ouais.
J'ai eu deux morceaux comme as, avec rond comme ça, épais comme ça, comme ça. Ah ouais. Deux morceaux comme as. Oh, super. Super. Vas-y mon pote. Merci. Allez, salut.
The international laws on cannabis are mainly described within the United Nations conventions. Although the world is changing, it seems that the United Nations Commission on Drugs and Crime is way behind. Even before the meeting, the International Narcotics Control Board, INCB, which oversees the implementation of the UN drug conventions, warned member states for being too progressive.
And in its annual report and press releases, the board has reiterated its position that legalization of cannabis for non-medical and non-scientific purposes contravenes the International Drug Control Treaty.
The policies towards medicinal use of cannabis are going to be more lenient if evidence-based and in cooperation with the pharmaceutical industry.
That medical cannabis or cannabis for medical purposes is within the mandate of the conventions.
I think we can continue to grow the crops that we need under control for use in the pharmaceutical industries. But we have to make sure that anything that is being done in an illicit manner outside the control is seriously controlled.
I think there are many opportunities within the convention to be able to find wonderful solutions to protect the health and welfare of mankind.
The INCB has no enforcement authority, but it can hold back necessary changes.
I find it very difficult to understand that so many millions of dollars and pounds in the end, and so many great minds have applied themselves to finding a solution for the world drug problem. And everyone comes up with one solution: legalize cannabis.
Everyone has their own pet subject. That is true. We must respect that. But I think out of this immense problem that we have, that there will be some great innovation.
The annual meeting held in Vienna was also a meeting ground of hardliners who want to continue the war on drugs.
So I think keeping drugs illegal is very important.
Anything that can basically harm a human being, that can actually affect his psychology, his decision-making capability, and can take him into the domain of addiction needs to be controlled.
There are various damages, and I think, for instance, cannabis is one of the most dangerous drugs if you look at it from its capacity to create psychological damages.
This year's meeting was set up to be a warming up for the UN General Assembly Special Session on Drugs, UNGAS, in New York City next April 2016. But realistically, nothing will change.
Are we going to have an open debate? You know, the Secretary General of the United Nations, when the UNGAS was first announced, he basically called on member states to have a wide-ranging and open debate that puts all options on the table for international drug control in the context of the UNGAS. And what we're seeing in the negotiations of, you know, how that UNGAS moment will look is some member states who are saying, yes, let's have an open debate, let's think about the future, let's think about all the options that are out there, and then those member states who are saying no new thinking, no new ideas.
If we don't have nations filing proposed amendments to these treaties in advance of 2016 at UNGAS, we will do in New York what we do here in Vienna year after year: talk, blow hot air, and make no change that's going to change the life of 360 million people worldwide that are criminalized because of drug prohibition.
Ik hoop eigenlijk uit te komen in New York dat natuurlijk gaan we kijken hoe op dit moment de verdragen worden uitgevoerd, maar dat we ook een zekere erkenning gaan krijgen van nieuwe ontwikkelingen. Kijk naar Zuid-Amerika, wat daar gebeurt. Dat vergt gewoon een andere aanpak.
Yeah, I think that the countries are dividing even more, and we're seeing across the spectrum more people who are taking a hardline position, and then other countries who are understanding that they need to try alternative policies.
Other UN agencies and former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan are more in tune with reality.
That the world is changing. Different approaches are being taken to the issue of drugs, and the fact is that if we in this room in this building at the UN now just deny that that is going on, that denial will ultimately undermine international cooperation on drugs.
But if you legalize drugs, more people will use and more people will be damaged by drugs. It's as simple as that.
But then I go to another report. Many reports show policy doesn't change anything.
Well, I don't believe that. No.
Als we vandaag een nieuw verdrag zouden moeten schrijven, dan wordt dat nog een lange weg waarvan de uitkomst heel onzeker zal zijn.
Prohibition has been infinitely more harmful than drug use itself.
Because the people worldwide know that the drug war is a failure. It's counterproductive. It causes the things it was designed to prevent.
Your source of cannabis news. Cannabis News Network.
Lots is being said about the quality of cannabis around the globe, the level of THC or the lack of CBD for more medicinal use. Also, cannabis is often polluted with pesticides and other materials to increase the weight. Cannabis News Network is introducing the Canna Test, a test which shows what compounds are present in the plant. Reporters from all over Europe will score weed to be tested in one testing facility. The goal is to record the state of cannabis available.
When you go to a shop, you're supposed to have the support of the state or the support of regulations to ensure our health and our safety. If I go to buy anything in which I'm consuming, they've had to go through so much rigorous standards, which is something which is missing right now from even the coffee shops.
The first test shows the level of cannabinoids. These are naturally occurring compounds. There are at least 85 active compounds identified in cannabis. We will focus on THC, which is the main psychoactive ingredient, and CBD, which has antipsychotic effects. We scored 3 samples to be tested. The first sample we bought in the south of Holland on the streets of Maastricht.
De la bœuf, de l'herbe. Au coffee shop, alors je prends pour toi dans le coffee shop, alors tu me donnes aussi quelque chose.
The second sample is also bought from a street dealer in Maastricht.
Pour fumer la coke, la héroïne, pas de problème, mon ami. Ecstasy, pas de problème.
The third sample we bought in Lille, northern France. With the second test, the cannabis is examined under a microscope to see if there are any pesticides or other harmful ingredients.
From the initial view, this looks quite nice, to be honest. There's a couple of dodgy things, but it's very typical of a commercial product. What we're looking at is all these resin glands here. I should see a stem and a head, almost like a mushroom. But what I see, first of all, is lots of stems, but no heads. And I see a gump here that's connecting several resin glands together. That is a big gump of pesticide. So normally they should all be coming up individual. It's very powdery, and like I say, that powderiness is basically residual pesticide. You see this here? This is not part of the plant. It's probably residual pesticide, but I must say this is very typical of cannabis that's bought in coffee shops as well. Most commercial weed is going to have some kind of spray on it. And sometimes they can do it in a smart way, and sometimes they can do it in a dangerous way. Essentially, any one of these contaminants, when burned, will release what's referred to as a pro-carcinogen. They activate by reacting in the body. So the more of these carcinogens which are present in the lungs, the more likelihood you have of mutations and lung diseases and pulmonary functioning. There is also some very dark material here and here, which these are probably spider mite eggs. That brown, black thing, that's a spider mite. Seems like they sprayed it and killed some of the bugs, but then there's still some dead bugs on here. You see that brown dot on the left? That's a spider mite. And that gump right in the middle is more pesticide.
So, we can conclude that the cannabis bought on the streets of Maastricht are about the same.
It's not contaminated, it's not overly fertilized. The only thing I would say about it is the rock hard bud is clearly a hydroponic grow.
And the sample bought in Lille, the most contaminated.
The one from France is really representative of what you'd expect to find on a street for a dealer. Is that it may be potent, but it's been mistreated. It's been very badly treated, and the results could be quite damaging for your health.
Next time, the test results of weed from Berlin, Valencia, and Vienna. Stay tuned to Cannabis News Network.
Your source of cannabis news.
In Poland, cannabis is highly illegal and treated as a public enemy. Even small amounts are not tolerated and penalties can be high. The use of medicinal cannabis is therefore a high risk. But now things are changing. For the first time, a young patient is allowed to be treated with cannabis oil legally.
Przeszliśmy absolutnie wszystkie możliwe metody terapeutyczne. Był taki moment, kiedy Max był na 5 lekach neurologicznych jednocześnie. Chcę powiedzieć, że koszt stosowania tych leków był ogromny i to nie koszt finansowy.
Dorota Gudenic, the mother of the 5-year-old Max, fought hard to be able to give her son the best treatment he can have, a treatment with cannabis oil.
I wtedy, proszę Państwa, uświadomiłam sobie, że skoro stoję pod ścianą i skoro moje dziecko ma umrzeć, to ja nie mam absolutnie nic do stracenia, a wszystko do wygrania.
Max suffers from a medication-resistant epilepsy and can now be treated legally under the supervision of doctors from the hospital of the Child Health Center.
To jest dziecko, które wyraża mnóstwo emocji, które pokazuje już swoje fochy. Pokazuje, że mu nie smakuje na przykład słona zupa w szpitalu. Zaczyna siadać, zaczyna robić rzeczy, których nie robił przez całe swoje życie, bo nie zdążył, zanim zachorował, a potem choroba zabrała mu wszystko.
The Constitutional Court ordered the government to deal with the legalization of medical cannabis issue. Despite the lack of support from the government, patients and their families started to act on their own.
Podziemie medyczne istnieje i dopóki nie zmądrzejemy jako naród, to podziemie będzie cały czas istniało. I takie dzieci jak Max, jest ich tysiące.
Jeżeli szkodzi cukier, szkodzi mleko, szkodzi gluten i wiemy o tym, a nie szkodzi marihuana, bo wręcz ratuje życie, to o czym my tu mamy rozmawiać?
Powinniśmy się domagać zmiany stanu obecnego, to żeby marihuana w różnych postaciach była dopuszczona do obrotu.
My przetrącamy młodym ludziom życie.
At the same time, the harsh Polish policy continues.
Zostałem aresztowany za przemyt oleju, zostały mi postawione zarzuty za międzynarodowe nabycie, przemyt dużych ilości substancji odurzających.
Jakub Gałdziewski, vice president of the association Free Hemp, was arrested for importing 900 mils of cannabis oil. That illegal oil was used in the treatment of his parents and many other patients. He faces up to 15 years in prison.
Ja się do tego nie przyznałem, ponieważ nie sprowadzałem żadnych substancji odurzających.
17 other young patients for who conventional medicine did not give any hope are now also being treated with medical cannabis. Despite that, the government hasn't changed any of the harsh laws.
Okażmy szacunek pacjentom, którzy z powodu zarekwirowania oleju niestety musieli umrzeć z powodu chorej ustawy i bandyckiej ustawy.
The fight continues.
The international drug control system is not perfect.
Not because drugs are good, but because prohibition is worse.
Your source of cannabis news. Cannabis News Network.
So, how does a cannabis social club work? Everybody has the right to have freedom of association, guaranteed by all modern and democratic legal systems. A social club is an association of members, of adult citizens who organize the cultivation of a limited amount of cannabis to satisfy their personal needs. A closed non-profit circuit between producers and consumers where certain requirements are met concerning health, safety, transparency and accountability. Cannabis social clubs are legally registered associations and open dialogue with authorities. Cannabis social clubs are typically grassroots initiatives started by citizens. In Barcelona, cannabis social clubs are in real danger. With the elections to be held in less than 2 weeks, the city's mayor, Javier Trias, has launched an attack against cannabis associations. He intends to close 80% of the clubs by means of a makeshift urban zoning.
Es una prueba más del nerviosismo del alcalde y más con las últimas encuestas, y es una medida electoralista populista que a las puertas de las elecciones, a 2 días de que empiece la campaña electoral, és un fraude democràtic.
Però el que està fent és llançar una pilota endavant, generar un problema nou.
A 15 dies de les eleccions, un pla espacial urbanístic.
Apparently, cannabis clubs, which are within 150 metres of schools, libraries, hospitals and gyms, are not allowed. According to the City Council, the aim of this plan is to limit the proliferation of clubs and thus protect our children.
Insisteixo, per què 150 metres? Per què?
És una distància que ens permet tenir una fotografia de la ciutat de Barcelona, que és 150, però 150 què és? És una línia de l'Eixample.
But this action has backfired. 3 days after the mayor's announcement, he tried to close down the Medical Green Social Club. The club summoned its members to an urgent assembly so that they would all be present when the police came. This way, sheltered by the Constitution, they avoided its closing.
Hemos podido parar un precinto, que yo creo que es la primera vez que ha pasado en Barcelona.
La asamblea se ha informado a los socios de la situación, se ha informado de que la asociación estaba todo cumpliendo con rigor la legalidad vigente, y los socios han decidido continuar con la celebración de la asamblea, pues es un derecho fundamental que pretendía ser reprimido por parte de la actuación del Ayuntamiento de Barcelona.
If clubs are being closed, they will claim compensation from the City Council for the investments they have made.
No hay más de 123 y le aseguro que como mínimo son 100.000 euros una media, ¿vale?, de inversión. El Ayuntamiento de Barcelona se va a gastar 12,5 millones de euros en indemnizar.
The plans of Mayor Trias violates the right of association of all people and directly favours the creation of cannabis monopolies, rather than promoting a model based on small neighbourhood associations.
Entonces, pues me gustaría saber qué va a pasar si cierran tantas asociaciones. ¿Dónde van a ir, por ejemplo, pues, mis socios terapèutics a los que he cuidado durante 2 años?
Fem una crida als representants polítics perquè assumeixin de forma immediata la responsabilitat de regular aquesta realitat social que d'una altra forma quedaria en mans del mercat negre i la delinqüència organitzada.
For now, the first battle has been won by the clubs, an embarrassment for Major Trias. Nevertheless, tensions will continue until elections are over.
No és una regulació finalista, ni molt menys.
Receiving a report from the Dutch embassy in Bangkok about a Dutchman wanted in the Netherlands for growing and dealing in marijuana.
Johan van Laarhoven deelt die cel met ongeveer 50 andere celgenoten en soms ook met een rottend lijf.
Johan van Laarhoven made his fortune as the owner of 4 coffee shops, amongst other legitimate businesses. This has led him to being imprisoned for almost a year in a jail in Thailand under horrific circumstances.
Die schrijnende situatie is een rechtstreeks gevolg van het minst genomen hoogst onzorgvuldige en onrechtmatige handelen van het Nederlandse Openbaar Ministerie.
The Dutch state accuses him of laundering criminal money and investing it in Thailand.
This money hasn't been laundered because in Holland coffee shops pay taxes. So the money is not laundered if you spend it in Thailand.
And this is where the confusion begins. The policy of the Dutch government operates under a double standard.
If you can sell it legally, you should be able to stock it and buy it legally.
The Netherlands has always been famous for its liberal approach to soft drugs and coffee shops, and they are a common sight in most cities.
Dit is een plek waarmee je toch zorgt dat mensen op een tussen aanhalingstekens makkelijke manier aan softdrugs kunnen kopen. En dus ook niet dan daarvoor naar de straat hoeven of wat dan ook. En ik denk dat dat een belangrijke voorwaarde is voor het beleid dat we voeren, gericht op de volksgezondheid.
As the owner of a coffee shop, you can sell weed and hash, but you cannot buy it.
Dutch government has a policy of tolerance, which means that you can sell cannabis in the front door of the coffee shop to the public, but you cannot buy it and you cannot store it. You cannot have a stock of cannabis. And that's a hypocritical situation, because if you sell cannabis, and in Holland it's about 200 tons of cannabis that is legally sold, where does it come from?
Officially, no one wants to know how and where they get their stuff. Compare this scenario with a bar. Amongst its products, a bar sells beer, but no one is interested in who supplies the barrels or where they come from. When the tap runs dry, a new barrel is attached. The so-called backdoor problem is the biggest paradox of the cannabis policy. For 40 years, the government has been turning a blind eye to the supply of cannabis to the coffee shops. Do they think it magically materializes or teleports in?
Als ik aan koffieshophouders vraag, hoe komt u eraan? Dan zeggen ze, dat weet ik niet. Ik zeg, maar daar moet toch wel regelmatige aanvoer zijn. Nou, daar kunnen ze natuurlijk ook niks over zeggen. Dat is een lastig punt.
The Dutch state is currently being sued by Johan van Laarhoven's lawyers to have him released from a cruel and inhumane prison in Thailand.
Johan van Laarhoven deelt die cel met ongeveer 50 andere celgenoten en soms ook met een rottend lijk.
Het is ook helemaal nooit de bedoeling van het OM hier geweest om Johan van Laarhoven te laten arresteren. Al helemaal niet in Thailand, dat betreur ik ook zeer. Maar ik kan niet de autoriteiten in een ander land vertellen wat ze dat niet moeten doen.
Well, that's a very hypocritical statement by the Dutch prosecutor, because there was a letter by the Dutch prosecutor sent to the Thai in which they explicitly request the Thai to initiate a criminal proceeding against Mr. van Laarhoven.
De Thai hebben onze informatie gebruikt om een zelfstandig onderzoek naar witwassen te starten. En dat is hun goed recht.
If you request the Thai to do that, they'll do that. And that's exactly what happened. And that's the only reason why he's in prison right now.
Recently, a majority in the Dutch parliament voted against any change in regulating the backdoor policy. So everyone working in the cannabis industry remains an outlaw.
The Dutch government is indeed declaring the coffee shop owners to be outlaws, to be subject to any kind of dictatorial regime and any kind of punishment that a foreign government might inflict on them.
Want het Nederlandse OM heeft na een uiterst onzorgvuldige rechtshulpoperatie, die de term koehandel alleszins verdient, de huid van Johan in ruil voor wat informatie verstrekt aan een openbaar ministerie in een dictatoriaal regime verkwanseld.
Well, we still hope that the judge will give a ruling earlier than the 7th of July. If it's the 7th of July, my colleague, Mr. Spong, will be in Thailand on the 9th of July to explain to the Thai judge what is going on in Holland.
Stay tuned to Cannabis News Network.
Your source of cannabis news. Cannabis News Network.
The Cannatest. We scored 5 samples to be tested. 1 from Vienna, 1 from Valencia and 3 samples from Berlin. The Görlitzer Park came to public attention because it's one of the hotspots in Berlin to buy weed. But locals complained about the nuisance of dealers and getting asked if they wanted to buy drugs as well. Since the 1st of April, the possession of minor amounts is prosecuted in the park and dealers have moved to the surrounding streets. But there are still some in the park.
Okay.
Our next stop is called Raugalender, which is the centre of party culture with a lot of bars and clubs nearby.
Kann man denn hier was kaufen?
We had to ask a few passers-by, but found a dealer just outside quite easily. For our last sample, we went to a private collection who, of course, does not want to be shown. In total, we acquired 3 samples, each about 3 to 4 grams for €30. The cannabis is examined under a microscope to see if there are any pesticides or other harmful ingredients.
This would appear to be relatively okay because we see lots of heads. The thing that concerns me though when I look at these is that there's no body to them. It's a bunch of heads all over. So you see we have a bunch of heads but they're not on any stem. There's just like a ball. There's a product that's literally called bricks and it's very common in Germany. And what they do is they spray on it to make it look like resin. So for me, the biggest issue with this is that I see all these balls everywhere but no stems. And then when I look at that area like this, and I can clearly see that these are not resin glands, but they have the same structure as the other part, it leads me to believe that this is not just a residual pesticide that's left over. This is something that's been put on that's intentionally designed to look like trichomes when you look under the microscope. This looks all right, to be honest. There's still some issues. There's no heads. We see here this sort of clump all over the resin. Now, much like the first sample, it's more rounded and it looks more like some goo, you know, as if it was liquidy and it's covering several resin glands. Now, the first one that we got from Germany, the difference is that the residue was sharper. It looked almost like actual crystals, lots and lots of salt. It could be bricks, it could also just be salt water. Sometimes they use sugar water and salt water to cover the weed, and then when it dries, it leaves crystals. The thing that concerns me instantly when I look at it, first of all, I don't see any heads. I see lots of stalks, but no round heads. All of the resin glands looks very rough. It looks quite powdery from a distance, you know? Resin should look very smooth. But this all looks very powdery and jaggedy. And when I zoom in close, this patch here is definitely not a resin gland. It seems like something is on top of the resin gland contaminating it. Once again, this is just residual pesticides. There's a nice big blob there in the middle of the screen. And that's definitely not meant to be there.
In Spanish Valencia, we visit its traditional festival of Las Fallas, the fires. The main object of the festival is the creation and destruction of ninots, puppets or dolls. But that is all that is burning. Although alcohol gushes, cannabis is not allowed. The Spanish team of Cannabis News Network wanted to see how easy it is to buy marijuana on the black market.
¿Sabes dónde puedo encontrar hierba?
Sí, si te esperas un momentito, sí.
Vamos a un sitio más tranquilos, que ya verás qué buena hierba tengo, que como está lleno de policía, que estamos en fallas, ahora hay que buscar un sitio escondido. Tengo de 2 clases, ¿eh? Mira, huele. Si quieres coca, también hay coca, ¿eh? Y pastillas y estas y lo...
No, gracias.
Again, it shows that you can buy everything from the streets. There is no difference between harder drugs, such as cocaine and heroin, and cannabis.
¿En la papelera las tienes escondidas?
Claro que sí, es el mejor escondite. Mira.
¿Y de dónde la consigues?
Esta es la planta de un amigo mío y pone todo orgánico. Nada de químicos ni...
We bought one sample and paid €30 for 4 grams.
This one looks quite nice. I mean, the first thing we can see is intact resin glands. Yeah, we had no heads on the last sample, whereas this one, if we zoom out, I mean, these ones are actually just nice individual. You see balls, you see heads. I don't see major contaminant issues. They're more better shaped. There's definitely not as much pesticide on here. In fact, none at all from what I can see. This is overall some okay weed.
In Vienna, you can buy cannabis as a plant, but you cannot use it. To get some weed to smoke, as a foreigner, is pretty hard.
I want to score some grass, some wheat. I don't know.
But it's illegal.
If you asked me, I think 3 years ago, maybe I could tell you something, but now I have no...
We started in the Vienna Westbahnhof. The atmosphere was dodgy.
How many? Just for €20 or something. Okay.
You go on, you have to go.
Where to?
2 stations with you, 3 and then 5 minutes.
No, I'm not going much further than here. Oh, Westbahnhof. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Just near...
outside the metro.
Outside the Bahnhof.
Yeah.
Behind the Kebab.
Yeah. Thanks, man. I'm trying to find some weed.
Was zum Rauchen braucht er.
Yeah. For about €20 or something.
Okay.
Thank you.
Eventually, we were able to buy everything again. Surrounded by heroin and coke junks, we bought 2 grams of weed for €20.
I can already see some contaminants on here. We see a lot of squares and globs, which when I zoom in, are definitely not going to look like the mushroom-shaped resin gland. Ooh, that's a very nasty one there. So you see that patch right there on the bottom left? How it's just like a giant glob that takes over half the screen? That shouldn't be there, and that is definitely some residual pesticide. This is really quite bad.
So, we scored 5 samples to be tested. We can conclude that the samples from the parks in Berlin and Vienna were the worst.
The quality of number 1, well, first of all, it came like all in crumbs. It was all powdery. It was squished into a little bag. While the THC percentage was one of the highest of them, it was easily one of the poorest in terms of contaminants, in terms of bud structure and appearance and smell. This one I would be quite disappointed with, in fact, if I were to have to buy this.
The one from Valencia and a private address in Berlin were the best.
It was actually quite rare for us in all of the samples to see a full resin gland. So this sort of stalk and head That's what we want to see when we look at weed, and we want to see it everywhere. Secondly, it had the best cannabinoid spectrum. I mean, what we see, there's a high amount of THC, but also you carry a little bit of THCV and some other ones. With that, having a more complete spectrum of cannabinoids will provide for a little bit nicer effect overall. It's not just going to be about the high of the THC, and it blends together some of the other ones.
What we also see is that the percentage of THC is quite high, 20%. If you're not an experienced smoker, it will do your head in. Stay tuned to Cannabis News Network.
Your source of cannabis news. Cannabis News Network.